in the United States, it was a very ruthless reaction to trade unionism. There wasn't this, like I said, the emergence of social democratic forces. There was more a violent crackdown, and of course you had the 1914 Ludlow massacre of workers. You had just many instances of class warfare, over rapacious and violent class warfare, where the ruling class, the capitalists, would hire thugs and scabs to come and mete out violence upon striking workers, and workers meeting to discuss their collective and common interests. And you had this kind of pattern emerge where where in the United States and of course later on in Germany, despite Bismarck's reforms, but I'm talking when Hitler came into power, this kind of attitude to trade unions that they weren't to be tolerated, they were menacing. And of course, one way to kind of circumvent that would be to enslave people, and that's where Professor Hall nicely leads us into the concentration camps and the slave labor camps in Nazi Germany. And there's an interesting twist to this story, because you have, of course, all these industrialists who, and this leads me into the sections I really want to kind of emphasize, the two sections, from progressivism to fascism on the contested frontiers of the empire of private property, and wars on Indians, Slavs, Jews, communists, and truth in the genesis of the military-industrial complex. So here you can see Professor Hall's lumping together Indians, i.e. the native people of the American hemisphere, with Slavs and Jews, the victims of Nazism, of the Hitlerian model of capitalism. And so you have these two polities, the United States and Germany, who basically are employing Lebensraum. And Professor Hall, a big portion of his book is going into the westward expansion and colonization of the country we now call the United States of America. And so these are the two sections I'd like to emphasize. This is the second section of the chapter, which I'm deconstructing, which is chapter 5 of Professor Hall's upcoming book, Earth into Property, which is published by McGill Queen's University Press. This section of the chapter is called From Progressivism to Fascism on the Contested Frontiers of the Empire of Private Property. So what Professor Hall is talking about here, from progressivism to fascism, is basically how you had this kind of progressive political force in the United States. President Roosevelt, the New Deal. Finally, people in the US could kind of feel their government wasn't totally acting in the interests of the capitalist class, and did have some modicum of interest in the interests of the working people, especially as they had experienced such downward mobility and such class warfare during the period of the Great Depression from 1929 onwards. And so what Professor Hall's basically very interesting going into, is how the capitalists obviously didn't want to have be fettered, to have restrictions, to be scrutinized by the state. And of course, how did they deal with this? Well, Henry Ford, for example, an infamous fascist and anti-Semite, he basically refused to sign any of the laws which were being enshrined to allow trade unionism, allow workers to mobilize and organize and so on. And so, this was part of Roosevelt's agenda, was, well, if you're going to, stop Marxist revolution, you have to allow the workers to at least have trade unions and have some kind of bargaining power. You can't just expect them all to be kind of obedient automatons that toil all day happily away, regardless of their conditions, their material conditions. And so here we see, that the Marxist analysis even filtering its way into bourgeois politics, which is interesting. And so, yeah, obviously, if you're going to have working class people en masse starving to death, it's not very conducive to a stable and a legitimate state. And so Roosevelt's agenda was rejected by the capitalists. They didn't like it. And in the meantime, you had this kind of fascism emerge. And fascism wasn't anti-capitalism. Lenin famously said, fascism is merely capitalism with its gloves off. And that's really what it was. And fascism, you hear this cliche today where governments talk favorably about private-public partnerships. Well, that's really all fascism was. It was incorporating corporations war profiteer corporations into the framework of the state, and having a mutually beneficial relationship to control a nation state and to prevent workers seizing control of the means of production, having workers' ownership of production, which is the basic tenet of socialism and communism, that workers would own the means of production and would reap the fruits of their labor, would not submit the fruits of their labor to a capitalist who works, who doesn't work, who produces nothing. You know, capitalists produce nothing. They're parasites on the backs of workers. And so how do you maintain this inequitable situation? How do you maintain a society of such double standards? Well, you need, of course, mythology. You need psychological warfare on the workers to foster false consciousness. And you need to really work hard with the capitalists to try and at least keep the working class with some form of employment and some basic standard of living that will prevent them from rising up and overthrowing that system. And so when many capitalists looked across the water at Europe and saw these fascists emerging, who were proudly building a strong nation state under the, you know, with rhetoric that was to some extent anti-capitalist, but in reality was very conducive to business. Why? Because one reason was they were extremely racist, and if they were extremely racist, that meant that they could divide and rule the working class easier. Number one. Number two, they were ruthlessly racist in the sense that they rounded up Slavs, Jews, homosexuals, dissidents, communists, you know, the arch enemy of the capitalist class, communists. They rounded them up. And when they rounded them up, what did they do with them? Well, the initial plan wasn't to kill anybody. The initial plan was to do what all elites want to do, and that's appropriate the fruits of their labor. They wanted them to work for them, so they'd produce things which they could then steal from the workers. And so, of course, you then experienced the Auschwitz slave labor camp, which later became a death camp. You experienced the opening of various basically slave camps. And we see this today, of course. I mean, when I think, you know, what would it look like today? When I watch a National Geographic, sometimes that show Lockdown. Lockdown is basically looking into, you know, it's a fly on the wall documentary about prisons. And when you look at prisons today, that's basically what we have. We have corporations profiting from enslaved labor of people that have been criminalized, usually unfairly. And the solution to that is to incarcerate them and enslave them. And that's exactly what we experience today. Similar corporatism, where the state, this public-private partnership, but really to benefit, you know, where the state acts in a sort of instrumentalist way for the capitalist class. It's an instrument of capitalist warfare, class warfare. And so when Professor Hall talks about from progressivism to fascism on the contested frontiers of empire and private property, another theme, of course, is you have the Soviet Union there, and all it embodies, which is basically an alternative to capitalism. And at that time, they weren't doing that badly. They had no markets, yet they managed to industrialize. How did a country manage to industrialize without any markets, without any stocks and shares? Well, they directed industry, they planned, they had a command economy. And I'm not saying that everything was rosy and hunky-dory, but it certainly offered a very successful model that in the end, let's be fair, managed to resist the Nazis, a country that was a medieval backwater a mere 2 decades previously, had managed to miraculously industrialize without any of these markets and, you know, all the rest, hedge funds and derivatives and all the euphemisms that we hear today. And so this obviously offered a complete and utter a threat to the international capitalist class, to the bankers and to the industrialists. And so what they obviously wanted was a bulwark, a country that would stand up strong against the Soviet threat, the tentacles of communism spreading into Western Europe. And the Hitlerian model, the Hitlerian defense of capitalism, Hall alleges, was the ultimate solution to that.